and welcome to Words Carry Us, an ongoing series of live stream and in-person events featuring readings and interviews from Greenkill in Kingston, New York. I'm Steve Clorfeine. I'm standing in for Words Carry Us founder Betty McDonald this evening, and I'm going to be interviewing and having a conversation with Jo Salas, the author of Mrs. Lowe Porter. So, say a little bit about Jo. Jo is the co-founder of Playback Theatre, which has become an internationally renowned community theater project. And I had a year of working with you in your Playback Theatre group quite a while ago. Mm-hmm. Jo is also a writer, and her previous novel was called Dancing with Diana. She's an essayist, a short story writer, and an activist of the highest order, I would say. I'm always impressed by what Jo is doing out in the world. So this book is a fictional biography of Helen Lowe Porter, who was the first English translator of the great 20th century novelist Thomas Mann. And Jo, how long did you work on this book?
You know, I have to go back and see when I really started it, but I think about 10 years. Uh-huh. Yeah, sort of not continuously, but off and on during that time.
And how did the project begin altogether?
Well, it depends how far back we want to sort of start the origin story.
Well,
I'll tell you.
I know it's way back.
But first of all, Steve, I just want to thank you for hosting me, and thank David and Greenkill for having us here. So I guess the sort of trigger for the book, the prompt for the book was going through some of her papers, which I had access to because her daughter was my mother-in-law. And when my mother-in-law died, she had been working on a project herself, a memoir about both her parents. Both her parents were quite distinguished people, and she was working on a memoir, and she had done quite a lot of research and had done some writing but hadn't finished it, and all of that came into our hands. So one day I sat down with it, this kind of plastic box of files that she had put together, and just read through it. And I had known about her for many, many years because she's, my husband's grandmother. But reading through this material, I felt I sort of encountered her in a new way. Mm-hmm. And she began to kind of take form for me. Mm-hmm. And I felt I was seeing somewhat of a different person from the family member that I had heard about all these years. And there was some particularly sort of visual images that began to kind of tickle me, and I found myself wanting to write about it. Yeah. And I didn't know at first if it was a short story or a novella, and after a while it kind of said, "Hello, I'm a novel," and then I committed to it at that point. Yeah.
So in this box were her correspondences with various people who are in the book.
Yeah.
And obviously others that you didn't pick up on for for information, but didn't enter into the novel itself.
Right. I mean, I chose to write a novel and not a biography, in part because, well, I'm not a biographer. I've written nonfiction, but not biography, and I didn't want to have to do everything that happened in her life and every person that she was involved with. I wanted to kind of I wanted to absorb what I felt were the kind of essences of her story as I understood them, as very subjective. And then find the moments of her life that really embodied those essences. So some of the people, obviously the people that she was most engaged with in her life, her family, Man, the publishers, Knopf, Alfred and Blanche Knopf, had to be there. But there were many other people that she knew who weren't directly relevant to the story that I was telling.
Yeah, I mean, she was living in a very challenging and exciting time with the women's movement in England particularly.
Right, the suffragist movement. She was a self-identified feminist from early on, very early on. And then she called herself a suffragist. She was committed to the women's right to vote. I have a chapter in there where she goes to a big suffragist rally, and not a suffragette rally, but a suffragist rally. And I don't know if that actually happened, but that's the kind of license that I had writing a novel.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very exciting choice that you made. You know, as challenging in its own way as writing a biography, I would say, because I know that you wound up doing a tremendous amount of research.
I did.
Aside from the correspondence that you know you needed to feed the story.
Right. Right. So I mean, there were lots and lots of questions that came up. I mean, for example, the suffragist. I mean, I knew a little bit about it, but I did a lot of reading and looking at material online, and I learned a lot about it that I hadn't known before. And then I kind of placed my Helen in that context.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a strong sub-theme in the book, as is her politics, and it was again this period of time is when communism is very attractive as a new form of people coming from the Soviet Union, and that has its effect in the book, and you deal with that in well, actually we'll find out later, but you put it in the form of a best friend. You bring in a best friend, which was I want to say more about that later.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you to read at this point, and it'll be an introduction to the main characters in the book.
Okay. So
is that okay?
That's great. And I just want to say, I mean, she was her political life. I mean, she lived through a very turbulent time. I just want to, the First World War, the Second World War, the rise of fascism, the rise of McCarthyism, and this was all this mattered to her. I mean, she was very engaged by all of that.
Yeah, and she was married to a Jew who didn't present very much as a Jew, and she was working with Man, who was as I remember, a fan of the Kaiser.
Yes,
married to a Jew, a very famous society Jew in that society in Germany. Right.
Anyway, so this piece that I'm going to read is it's from fairly early on in the story, where she'd begun to work on. She had been engaged by the Knopfs to translate Buddenbrooks, which was the first of his novels to appear in English, and she was in the middle of working on it, and this is what happened. Mrs. MacDonald flung open the front door when they returned from their morning walk. "Visitors," she whispered. "Foreigners. I put them in the drawing room." A man was standing by the mantelpiece when Helen and Elias entered. Elias is her husband. He stepped forward, his hand extended. "Frau Low-Porter," he said with a slight bow, and she realized with a shock who it was, though he did not look anything like her mental image of a white-bearded sage. This man, now shaking her hand and smiling stiffly below his dark moustache, was tall and good-looking, middle-aged like herself, wearing blue pinstripes. He looked like a businessman. Behind his shoulder, a head shorter, was a sombre, dark-haired woman. Herr Mann, Frau Mann. The formulas of politeness all but deserted her. This is my husband, Professor Elias Lowe. She repeated the introduction in German, to her horror, stumbling over the perfunctory words. Her mind was speeding like a train. Soon after she had begun to work on Buddenbrooks, Mann had referred in a letter to a possible visit to Oxford with his wife, not mentioning a date. She forced herself not to look wildly around the room. Had Mrs. MacDonald finished tidying it before the Manns arrived? Was Marjorie's jigsaw puzzle still on the floor? Herr Mann had probably had time to study the bookshelves and would have noted the gaps in their collection, works of poetry and fiction far outnumbered by tomes on paleography of no interest to a literary man. She prayed that the door to her study was closed. Mann's half-translated work was spread out on her desk, no doubt resembling a dreadful jumble to anyone besides herself, particularly the author. And now I will have to talk to them in German, she thought, and Mann will see how poorly I speak. She hadn't conversed in German for years. Helen was stricken again by the idea of a genius like Mann forced to depend on someone as flawed as herself. Poor man, and it's too late to dump me. Elias, on the other hand, was in his sociable element. Do sit down, Herr Mann, Frau Mann, he said, gesturing to the couch, free, thank goodness, of newspapers and splayed books. We'll have some tea. How wonderful to meet you both. May we show you Oxford? We'd be happy for another walk, wouldn't we, Helen? His own German had many more mistakes than Helen's, but he endowed it with charm and lightness. Helen excused herself to make the tea, hunting for something, anything, to accompany it. She cursed her failure to keep the cake tins filled. Bread and butter, that nursery standby, would have to do. With relief, she remembered the mandarin oranges that Elias had brought from London, an indulgent treat. She placed them in a bowl, then trickled filberts and raisins around them. Her heart rate was returning toward normal by the time she brought the tray into the room, but she let Elias carry the conversation. She could not get over the strangeness of having this abstract figure in her house, not to mention his silent wife, who, Gilbert Brooks had told her, was a formidable and wealthy personage in her own right, and the overseer of Mann's career. It was not just Mann's literary stature that daunted her, it was his non-corporeal presence in her daily thoughts, on the pages she studied so carefully, in the letters that they exchanged with increasing frequency. She was not ready for him to also possess a body, a face, and an audible voice. Elias raised his eyebrows in appreciation when he saw the oranges in their still life arrangement. The Manns accepted the tea but ate nothing, even when Elias carefully peeled a mandarin and ate it with hearty enjoyment, as though offering an example. What did they want? Helen wondered. Why had they come? The conversation, largely between the two men, remained banal, as though they were four strangers sharing a train compartment, German and English strangers, with the unmentionable war between them. Yes, they had enjoyed their time in London. Yes, the weather was ideal for travelling. Well, said Elias, when the teacups had settled back on their saucers and remained there, shall we have a look at Oxford? They walked along the city streets, Elias recounting the historical and architectural significance of the beautiful old buildings. After a while, as she recovered from the shock of meeting him, Helen found herself wishing that she and Mann could talk about the novel. What an opportunity, after all, to discuss the translation in person. But she was far too shy to bring it up, and Mann made no allusion to the fact that the two of them were intimately engaged in a project of the greatest importance to them both. She wondered if he was as shy as she was, or perhaps too stunned by the fleshly reality of his translator, as unsettling for him, surely, as his was for her. The man said goodbye with what Helen imagined was relief, akin to her own. They were staying one more night, they said. But you must join us again, said Elias. He glanced at Helen for a quick endorsement. Our friend in the German language department is hosting an evening party tomorrow night. How wonderful if you would come. To Helen's surprise, Man accepted without hesitation. His wife nodded minutely. They shook hands again and disappeared into their hotel. As soon as they were gone, Helen turned to Elias. Are you sure, Elias? Shouldn't we have asked Baxter first? Of course they'll want the Manns to come. What an honour for us all. But, to their enormous embarrassment, Professor Baxter, after consulting his colleagues, declined to invite Herr Mann. Simply too uncomfortable, he explained. As a defeated German, Mann had not yet displayed the remorse that the Oxford community thought was fitting. He was known to be a nationalist, after all, and an ardent supporter of the Kaiser. And the war had ended only 6 years ago. They felt it was too soon for hospitality, with great regrets, Professor Lowe. Elias was astounded and angry, Helen chagrined. As compensation, Helen and Elias found one eminent couple who were delighted to host the great writer and his wife for afternoon tea. Yesterday's mild spring weather had turned blustery, but all was calm and peaceful in the Yardleys' pale green drawing room, where the bookshelves were as redolent of literature and ancient Greek drama as any modern literary legend could wish. Helen interpreted for Man, her tongue now loosened. He sat back in his leather armchair, legs crossed, a well-shod foot dangling, teacup in hand, laughing with evident enjoyment, as well as politeness. Frau Mann melted with the attention of the little dog, who snuffled around her feet and then alighted on her lap. Lady Yardley, in her innocence or boldness, asked about the translation. Helen translated the question and held her breath. I have seen enough pages to know that it is going extremely well, he said, smiling at Helen. We look forward to publication soon. Helen managed to get this into English, something warming inside her.
Mm. So this is an incident that you know occurred.
Yes.
And besides the incident itself, could I ask you what else you knew from research and correspondence?
Well,
because
how long do we have?
No, I mean, because I'm
yeah.
very interested in, how you construct this event altogether that tells us quite a bit
right.
about everyone, about all four of
Yeah.
them, just by description and reading into that moment particularly Helen, who's the character who's close to your heart here.
Yeah.
How she would be feeling.
Right.
And you get these you get a lot of information about her, sort of low self-esteem to some degree. Mm-hmm. Her that strange cultural thing about, is the house a mess?
Strange cultural thing.
Yeah, well, I
mean
mean for proper English people
right,
at that time.
I mean, many of us are still afflicted with that that concern.
I know.
Yeah.
I always appreciate people who aren't.
I do too.
Yeah. But would you talk a little bit about that? How much how much you're creating, constructing there,
right.
and how conscious you are of illuminating mm-hmm. things that you don't have to spend a lot of time on otherwise.
Right. So in this case, she did write about this moment herself, much more briefly. But she did talk some. I think it's in her essay about. She wrote a long essay called "On Translating Thomas Mann," and she did describe that moment where they appeared. I mean, they had vaguely, the Manns had said vaguely, one day we'll be. They lived. Helen and Elias lived in Oxford because he was a professor there, and they'd said they would come sometime, but they had no idea that they were coming then. So she wrote about that and how she was, she expressed some of those things that I then put in the chapter.
Yeah.
Being flustered, seeing him so different from her mental picture and so on. So I fleshed it out. I mean, I had more to work with there to create a scene, creating a scene.
Yeah.
And yes, I wanted to bring in these other elements, but in that case, her reminiscence had given me a lot. But there are lots of other places where I'm kind of prompted by something very brief that she said in a letter.
Yeah.
So, for example, she wrote a letter. She was always being told by Knopf and by Mann to hurry up. She could never work fast enough for them, and she was. These were huge books that she was working on, and she had 3 kids, and she had a husband who was very demanding. But they were always saying, couldn't you get this to us by next week, and so on. So she wrote to him at one point, and she said, she was kind of apologizing for being late, and she said, we've had the chicken pox here. And that's all she said. And I think she said, we've had the chicken pox and lumbago here. And that's all she said. And it was kind of light, sort of flippant.
Yeah.
But it was by way of explaining that, why she had taken longer than they wanted.
Yeah, yeah.
And I sort of constructed a scene around that. And, I'm bringing my own imagination and my own life to some extent into it.
Right.
I mean, I'm imagining her looking after sick children with chicken pox.
Yeah.
It's not fun.
Yeah.
And so in that case, I'm just imagining that and describing it. And I don't know exactly what happened, but it was that throwaway line that led me into that.
Yeah, and you've also spoken about using your own experience as a wife, as a mother,
and a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's interesting. These little details like the mandarin oranges. I mean, maybe she mentioned that.
No, she didn't.
No. So you have this. You've constructed this little detail.
Yeah.
That says something about the way Elias relates to her, but also how she defers to him, how happy she is that that they're there to sort of save that moment where there's only bread and butter.
Right.
And then his showiness also just in that gesture of opening the mandarin to show that it's possible to be eaten.
So that's just, imagination.
Yeah, but I'm always struck by what details, particularly imagined ones, tell us about people that, a description like saying, Elias was, self-consumed. He was proud. He was this. He was that. You never do anything like that.
No.
You just report the gestures and you kind of get it in that. Which is
good. I'm glad it works like
I'm
that.
liking that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you say something about the structure of the book? Because I was taken in the way you moved back and forth from one era to another, and you described there being 5 flash forwards in the book.
Right. Yeah, so it's mostly chronological, and it starts in 1906 when she traveled to Munich to study, and that's where she met Elias.
As a 18, 19?
No, she was almost 30 at that point.
Oh,
yeah.
really?
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
She had graduated from Wells College, which was kind of a family tradition. Her aunt and mentor had gone there as well. Wells College, which is sadly closing right now, one of the colleges that is having to close its doors. She had, so she had graduated from there, and she had, waited a while to travel to Europe, which she really wanted to do. And there she met Elias, who was also an American. He was an immigrant from Russia who had grown up in New York, and had traveled to, he was studying in Munich. And so it goes on from there, chronologically, through their life together and not together. But there are about 5 times when I skip forward to 1963, which is close to her death. She's a very old lady.
Mm-hmm.
She's about 86 at that point. And I did that for various reasons. But so in those chapters, those flash forwards, she's very elderly and she's a little bit losing her cognition.
Yeah.
So she gets a bit confused, but she's reflecting about her life. She's reflecting on things that, then we learn about in the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But I did that in part because Man obviously is very important in this story, in her relationship with Man and the work that she did. But he doesn't enter the story until the 1920s. And I wanted him to be a character earlier than that.
I see.
So he comes into that first flash forward. And then, we go back to the chronological story, and a few chapters later, she is asked to translate
Mm-hmm.
Buddenbrooks.
Yeah. Good. So I know I wanted to ask you about creating the lives of the characters who are imagined by you.
Mm-hmm.
So we know she has 3 daughters. We know she has a best friend.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not drawing on any particular detailed research other than that these are people. Well, maybe in the case of Pauline, yes. But so I guess I'm interested in what kind of choices you make to give these personalities to her 3 daughters, kind of out of the blue in a way. Or maybe you've heard some things, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know.
Well, I knew 2 of her daughters.
Uh-huh.
One was my mother-in-law, and one was her sister. The other one had died before I met my husband. But I didn't, and then, I know most of the cousins, their children,
Uh-huh.
but I deliberately did not want to bring those real people into this story, mostly because, the cousins, the children of these 3 daughters are mostly still living, and they have their own stories,
Yeah.
which those are their stories to tell.
Yeah,
They're not
yeah.
my stories to tell.
Right.
And nor is Helen's really, but she's not in our world anymore, and I have some, I don't know, I took for myself some right to tell her story, to
Yeah.
wanting to bring her sort of from the shadows into the light.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to portray her 3 daughters in any kind of realistic detail. So I imagined them, my imaginary Helen has 3 daughters, but only the youngest one, Marjorie, I call her Marjorie, has much relationship to the real daughter. So Marjorie is sort of based on Patricia, my mother-in-law, but not totally. So when I think of them, I think of Patricia, I think of Marjorie. I don't think of them as the same person.
Right.
But Marjorie does have some of Patricia's characteristics and facts of her life. So she's not entirely imaginary.
Yeah.
But I did imagine her friend, Pauline.
Pauline, yes, this was an interesting one.
Right. So Helen had close women friends throughout her life. And I know a little bit about them. I have a lot of letters from one woman, particular in England, wonderful letters, and I did draw on those a little bit. But I invented Pauline just to kind of be in that place of Helen's friend. I mean, I had to simplify that. Again, if I was writing a biography, I would mention all of these different women that she was close to, at different times lived with. But I wanted to keep it a simpler narrative than that.
Yeah.
So Pauline appeared, and she stood in that place, and
Yeah.
she became very real for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the way you're working with the children and even the grandchildren to some extent, and especially with Pauline, is using them, so to speak, using them to draw out more of Helen's character.
Exactly. Right.
And it really works wonderfully, because again, it's this kind of shorthand where you're exploring your Helen, as you say, and you're taking the opportunity of how people, how she's mirrored by her three daughters, and then in the very end by that one grandson that she feels very close to.
Right.
The only one really that perks her up.
Yes, I mean, a little earlier in the book, there's the granddaughter as well, Kate, and she was based on a real granddaughter, that Helen was very close to.
She's the one who wanted to go to Wells College. No, that was
her daughter.
That was her daughter.
Yeah,
Okay.
Kate was the one that overheard her grandparents fighting.
Right, when she was about 8 years old or something.
Yeah. And that actually came from a reminiscence from that granddaughter.
Yeah.
So the grandson that she was close to, and that she adored when he was a baby, he's also pretty much invented. I mean, I know that Helen loved her grandkids, but in reality, they don't remember her so fondly. Her daughters did. I mean, I have a lot of letters from her daughters to her that were clearly they loved her very much. You know, it's all darling mummy and dearest mummy, and just, but the grandchildren didn't feel close to her for the most part. But I'm doing fiction.
But that was also a very difficult part of her life when the grandchildren came in. I mean, she was removing herself from the marriage. She was just very oppositional with herself.
Well, and she became kind of a nomad. I mean, she lived in England, then she lived in the US. She went back and forth.
Yeah.
She didn't have her own home really for a very long time. Yeah.
There's a lovely part of her living in the U.S. where Elias has this big position at Princeton, and she's living with him
at the Institute
Princeton.
for Advanced Studies.
Yeah, and she has a relationship with Einstein.
Yes,
I found that very endearing that that she would have this eccentric to some degree, but very down to earth person, sort of gifting her with friendship in a very staid society that he himself refuses to be part of.
Yeah, and that was fact. I mean, that was factual. Yeah. They were fond of each other, and they would write sort of silly poems for each other. And,
yes, it was very sweet. I sort of envied her that part of her life. About Pauline, we talked a little bit about how a writer uses a fictionalized character to fill in something that can't be filled in, or that might be the best way to fill in a gap. You want to talk about Helen's feminism. You want to talk about Helen's socialism, so to speak, or her admiration of the revolution in the Soviet Union and so on, but you really put it in the hands of the other character, Pauline, to draw it out, and I found that very very skillful. I mean, I'm not a novelist, so I'm always in admiration of how a novelist will put those pieces together to construct a puzzle in the most economical way, because it's it's not a long novel.
Right.
You could have gone.
Yeah, I mean, it's all the story. Hopefully, is kind of unfolding through relationships and dialogue, and locations. So yeah, I'm seeing it visually as I'm writing. I'm sometimes hearing hearing their voices.
Yeah.
It's quite. There's a kind of sensory aspect to it for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's a, when you read the book, you'll find out that she's married a very unusual man in a lot of ways, but in one way that turns out to be a powerful irritant for her, that when they're first married, he declares that he has a very strong libido and he's going to be sleeping with other women. And this goes through until there's a breaking point. And it's, one really feels for her from the very beginning when she really was shocked hearing this. They just knew each other, not that well at that point.
In the way I had imagined it, it's shortly after they get married that he tells her that.
Yeah.
So that also was based on reality.
Yeah.
And interestingly, some of these details came to me directly from Helen's writing or from letters. Some of it came to me from Patricia, my mother-in-law. So this was something that came from Patricia. So she told me about that aspect of their marriage, and she learnt about that from her father. He told her about it when
That's actually in the book.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that again, I'm taking a lot of liberties, but
Yeah.
I'm weaving a lot of historical fact into it. So he told her about that, and that they had this understanding.
Yeah.
And she took his word for it, but I didn't. So I heard this story about his kind of describing their relationship, his kind of being oversexed, as he put it, and had too strong a sex drive, and wanted to have this understanding with her. She kind of took that to mean, nobody wants to talk about their parents' sex lives, right? So she just took that to mean that they didn't really have a passionate relationship, and it was okay with her because they had an intellectual relationship. That was how she understood it.
Yeah.
But I didn't see it that way. There were things that, some of her poetry, she adored him. They did have a passionate erotic
It comes through in
relationship.
the book. Yeah.
And I'm convinced about that. And so then I'm imagining, what was it like for this young woman who was very sexually inexperienced, for her husband, who was much more worldly, to spring this on her, and what could she do but well, he knows more than I do, I guess I'll get used to it.
Yeah.
But she was not happy.
Yeah.
I'm certain of it.
So she continues to be in these three relationships with very powerful men.
Yeah.
Elias, her husband, Mon, who she's translating for 20 years?
36 years.
36 years. And Alfred Knopf, the publisher
Right.
of Knopf, who is also, kind of sitting on his wife in a certain way. And so one begins to, throughout your book, feel so much sympathy for her in a certain way, that she has to go through this, and that she, at a certain point, she has to put up with his lies about his affairs. Elias's lies about his affairs. And so it's not surprising that when the final blow comes, when he has a little tryst with one of his daughter's best friends, that she explodes.
Yeah. I think the implication is that up to that point, part of their agreement is that, he has generously offered to tell her every time he has a little romance.
Because he's traveling, and it's far away.
Yeah. And I'm not going to be dishonest with you. I'm going to tell you. I don't know how she felt about that. But kind of annoying, but but then then he goes too far, and he claims, I don't know, he claims and again, this comes through his daughter to me.
Yeah.
He claims that it was the very young woman who seduced him. It was her fault.
Yeah.
And he just, he was a, silly middle-aged man that he's a powerful professor. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
so, that was, and then I read his diaries in the Morgan Library.
Yes, I was very impressed about you doing research in the Morgan Library.
Yeah, it was wonderful being there.
Yeah.
But I
it's a
sat
great
there
place.
for hours with he had these little pocket diaries. And it was not like a one-time thing with her.
Yeah. Oh, with the young
Yeah,
woman. Oh,
yeah.
my goodness. Wow.
So
Titillating.
That's where he was not telling the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Joe, this brings me to something that we mentioned. I wanted to ask you how feminism entered your life, growing up in New Zealand, and how that became simultaneously or parallel social activism.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is, it's one of the things that I relate to Helen about. I was very involved in social justice movements from the time I was 12 or 13.
Uh-huh.
First of all, the youth campaign for nuclear disarmament. I had friends who were involved, and it just woke me up, and I was very active and would go on marches, and then that same group of people, when the Vietnam War started, began to get involved in protesting Vietnam, and so I was part of that as well, and would be sort of dragged up to sing on the steps of Parliament. They knew I could sing a bit, so they would drag me up there to sing.
What did you sing?
We Shall Overcome.
Yes.
Anyway, so that was all part of, pretty integral in my life, and almost got me, the US wouldn't give me a visa because of all of that when I first tried to come here.
Yeah.
But I didn't get involved in feminism until after we were married. We were married very young, and by then we were living in England, in the middle of nowhere, really the middle of nowhere, and we had a little baby, and I was 21, and we went into a bookstore in Exeter, and I had heard about The Female Eunuch, the book, Germaine Greer's book, and I remember, I knew this was going to change everything. And I remember my hand actually shook when I picked it off the shelf. And it did change everything. So sometime after that, we came back to the US, and I got involved in the women's movement.
Yeah, interesting. It's a great story. So, we don't have too much time, especially if we want to have a little Q&A opportunity. But would you read from the chapter, what is it, 35?
Okay, and just to say, we haven't really talked much about Helen as a writer herself.
I know, or the whole topic of translation altogether,
Right.
which we talked about being such a hot topic these days, and a sort of revolution, revolution in translating.
I mean, she was translating at a time when translators were kept way in the background.
Yeah.
And her name sometimes wasn't even on the title page.
Yeah.
And but she also was a writer. She was a very committed writer who struggled all her life to find success as a writer, and she didn't really find the success that she wanted.
Yeah.
But the novel is a lot about that, about her quest, her yearning to fulfill her own artistic vision as well as Mart's.
I do want to mention that there's this beautiful part where she kind of almost rails about what it is to translate Mann
Yeah.
from German into English, and how
Yeah.
nobody but her could possibly understand what that the intensity of that dance.
Yeah.
And you do a beautiful description of that
Yeah.
somewhere.
I mean, she was frustrated because people didn't understand. I mean, other translators
Yeah.
would have, but yeah. So this chapter is really about her life as a writer. And at this point, she's not with Elias, she's living with Pauline, and it's called This Upstart Crow. Takes place in 1936. For months, the London newspapers had been full of royal upheavals: the death of the beloved king, the succession of his popular son, the new king's refusal to rule without the woman he loved and wished to marry, the church's refusal to accept a queen who was foreign and divorced, therefore immoral, the surprising protests from commoners who thought a king should be allowed to choose his mate. "Spoiled, self-important idiots, the lot of them," said Pauline, looking at a photo of the assembled royal family in their finery. "What they need is a revolution. Where are the Bolsheviks when you need them?" Helen agreed in principle. The monarchy was an anachronism, a feudal system that should have no place in the modern world. Hereditary privilege should be banished, as in the Soviet Union, letting equality reign in its stead. "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs," quoted Pauline, if given a chance. She was still determined to visit Moscow. Helen shared her idealism, but expressed caution. There had been disturbing rumors of brutality in Stalin's utopia. "Well, we should go and see for ourselves," Pauline had said. "Well, maybe we shall," responded Helen. The current chaos in the British establishment seemed to offer up the possibility of something new, not communism, but a departure from the old ways. "He's not like the others," protested Helen. "He's almost a socialist. Look at his solidarity with the Welsh miners." "Don't be taken in, dear," said Pauline. "He has no more political analysis than my old tabby cat. It's sentimentality at best, if not cynical posturing. He's a solid right-winger at heart, like the rest of them. You'll see." "Good heavens," said Pauline a week later, slapping the evening paper, then holding it up so Helen could see the huge headlines. "He's going to do it. He's going to abdicate. How very Shakespearean it all is." The word pulled a switch for Helen. Shakespearean, indeed. A situation worthy of a Shakespearean play, or at least an ersatz Shakespearean play. Royalty, succession, defiant love. She was seized with the old desire to write, to create, an almost erotic desire that she thought had gone forever, suddenly back full force. The play demanded to be written. She would call it Abdication, or All is True, stealing Henry VIII's original name for her subtitle. It was a perfect moment. Her most recent translation was on its way to Knopf. Before long, the next one would land on her desk with a thump. But now, a little gap, a hiatus, enough to get started, at least. Helen leapt in with the ghost of Aunt Charlotte cheering her on. Blank verse flowed like a native language. She knew, even as she wrote, that it was the most dreadful nerve to adopt this archaic style, but it so accommodated the story and her own passion and humour. The pleasure was exhilarating. She sat down at Pauline's little dinner table each evening, tired but energized and merry, drinking her glass of red wine with a sense of well-deserved reward. It had been years since she had been filled with this particular happiness. The play found its shape with relative ease. Her characters took on their own fictional lives. They were and were not the real-life royal characters, now riveting the attention of the country. Her abdicating king was not Pauline's self-indulgent ignoramus, but a noble idealist who had earned the support of the common man. He adored the woman he wanted to marry with a passion and loyalty that stirred yearning in his creator. What must that be like, to love someone enough to defy the demands of history, to be loved like that? She turned away from the thought before it pushed her into sadness again. Helen stilled herself to hear her characters' voices, crafting their words, choreographing their encounters on the stage. The work elated her. She felt at last the sense of alignment that had been so elusive, each facet of her life at last in its rightful proportion. In the mornings she sprang out of bed before it was fully light, eager to return to the page she had left the night before. The inevitable artistic obstacles left her undaunted. After 4 weeks, she had a draft. She gathered the manuscript together and sat down to read, pencil in hand. Again, she had a sense of surprise, as though these words and characters were not her own creation. She found herself entertained by their earthy wit, their pathos. The final pages made her chortle aloud. "What's funny, love?" Pauline asked, looking up. "Sorry," Helen said. "I didn't mean to interrupt you." "May I read you a few lines, Pauline? It's the epilogue. I've enlisted the bard himself to do it." "Have you now?" Pauline put down her book and took off her glasses. "I'm listening." Helen stood up with her pages and struck a bard-like pose, a theatrical sneer on her face. "This upstart crow hath thought to beautify herself with my feathers, and hath bombasted out some lines of black verse, as cometh pat to my tongue, since it hath in my time been said of me too, though truly the wench doth not merit the coupling," etc., etc. He goes on for a page or so, craving the audience's indulgence on my behalf. Pauline clapped her hands and whistled. "You are indeed a wicked wench, Helen," she said, "very wicked and very clever. Didn't Shakespeare get called an upstart crow by one of his rivals? Yes, I stole it, magpie that I am. And why not, Helen? This play is going to be a great success. I do believe that it will." Helen stared at her. She felt a sense of confidence and accomplishment that had never accompanied her own writing before. The Mann translations brought a kind of stolid satisfaction, a journeyman's pride in a job well done. The artistry of it was covert, not like this, not this headiness of pure creation, this mysterious sense of aesthetic rightness, the right word, the right dramatic action to embody the meanings and turnings and archetypal echoes of the story. Was it possible that Pauline's words were prophetic, that at last she had written something that was going to succeed?
Great, thank you.
And in fact it did.
Yes,
So,
it's a very interesting. It's
she-
the life of that play.
Yeah,
that you
so
describe.
it was rejected for a long time, but 12 years later it was produced very successfully in Dublin, and then it was published by Knopf. This is the book,
Yeah.
with a very, very tattered cover, but it has photos and
The sense you gave was that he finally couldn't not publish it.
he was reluctant.
Yeah,
But he
yeah,
did.
yeah,
He published it. Yeah.
I think we have a little bit of time if there are any questions from the in-person, as we say these days, audience. And if you do have a question or a comment, or just step up to the microphone. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but you're welcome to.
And I'll just say something while they're thinking if they have a question or not. What Helen, in that passage, what she says about her characters in the play being the historical characters but not being the historical characters, that's kind of how I feel about my characters, that they are and they are not.
Would it be possible for you to locate that section where she talks about translation?
Well, there are a couple of, there's the chapter, the wooden doll, or there's another part where she's trying to explain to Knopf, this is just a sentence. Is that what you mean?
Try it,
okay.
Since you found it easily.
So she said, and this is taken from a real letter. She says, I'm reasonably certain that TM and Katja, the Mans, both would rather take a chance of a bad translation, if only it could be done more quickly, both of them having a pretty slight regard for translations in general, and mine in particular. I doubt if he understands that his books would not have made money in English translation if they had not, out of my profound respect for the English tongue, been easily readable. And what do I mean by easily readable? My aim always is to get Mann's words into my ear and feeling, and then create as meticulous, supple, and intuitive rendering of the original as I possibly can. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, no, good. There's another one also, but I just really wanted to make sure we had something about translation in this conversation, because there's so much to say about it. I remember, I think it was the writer Rachel Cohen said, translating is like riding two horses at once. I thought it was very, apt image.
Yeah, and I just read a quote from another translator who said, he said something like, if you're thinking of doing translation, don't.
Yeah.
And,
That's what I often say to theater students. If you can find anything else that you love to do that.
Yeah.
Well, good. I think we'll bring it to a close at this point.
Were there any questions?
Just a big thank you.
Oh, okay.
Another big thank you to Joe. And I wanted to say the book, we have a couple of copies of books over there if you'd like to buy them. And for the listening audience, to say that the books are in bookstores all about. Also through Bookshop and Amazon and what was the other?
Barnes and Noble.
And Barnes and Noble, and in the library as well, especially the Mid-Hudson Circulating Library, because Joe did a session like this in the New Paltz Library.
And if bookstores don't have them, any bookstore can order it.
Yeah, it'll come around. Good. So thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you
very
so much,
exciting
Steve.
to have this conversation with
That's
you.
great.
Yeah,
Thank you
live,
so much.
live.
Yeah.
And I wanted to mention about the gallery here, Greenkill, that the exhibition here in May and June is a solo multimedia presentation of the work of Richard Curling. And the hours for the exhibition space are Saturdays and Sundays, 1 to 6. And Greenkill is a public arts performance and education space. Always really grateful to David Schell for founding this place and running it with such diligence, really. And he's shaking his head. All right. Anyway, he organizes and makes things happen here. So thanks to the live stream audience for being with us tonight, and the live audience out there. And I'm supposed to say, as Betty McDonald says, Greenkill out.